Welcome. It's just gone 7 p.m., Wednesday, the 22nd of January, and you're watching episode 156 of Regional Wrap. Regional Wrap, providing insight of the issues affecting regional Australia and giving voices to regional residents. My name is Bill Bates, and joining me on this episode, Australia Day by any other day, is my guest, Christopher Reynolds, educator, political advisor, and author. Chris is an accomplished academic, completing his PhD and master's degree at the prestigious Claremont Graduate University in California. He is also the only Australian to hold senior staff office appointments with both the United States Senate and House of Representatives. Chris is also the author of What a Capital Idea, Australia, 1770 to 1901. The most comprehensive and accurate record of Australian history ever published. It investigates the reasons for political and commercial decisions, chasing down the money trail, looking for the context and people behind the events. With a unique focus on the economic development, the research challenges much of the prevailing narrative of Australia's history. Welcome, Chris.
Good evening, Bill.
Well, we're doing this program tonight as we come on to Australia Day on the 26th, which will be Sunday this year. Of course, double time for all the employees out there who've got working that day, or maybe time and a half, double time and a half. But we have this conversation in the media and that as for sometimes a little bit earlier than this, of course, but it usually happens every year, and people have got their opinions on Australia Day, what it means, when it should be held, and of course the impact of Australia Day on the Indigenous people of the country. So what we'll look at tonight, and I'll ask you a few questions, is the 26th of January the best day, or are there other suitable alternatives? But I get the impression now, because the voice referendum and then there's things that happened last year, especially with Woolworths deciding not to sell Australia Day paraphernalia and the pushback against that, there's more vocal support for January 26th, but it's more as a result, as most people don't know Australia's history well enough to pick any other day as a better day. So we'll explore that.
So can I tell you a story?
You can.
All right. You wave at me or something when you think that's enough of the story. Well, it all really starts because Lachlan Macquarie, Governor Lachlan Macquarie, really liked a party. And when he arrived in Australia, the first thing he had to do was clean out the rot after the Rum Rebellion, because Sydney was probably the most corrupt colony in the whole of the British Empire. So once he got rid of the rot and they were all gone, within 6 months, it was the King's birthday. I think it was June the 3rd. So he said, well, why don't we have a party and I'll open up the gardens in front of Government House. Well, all these people showed up, and of course they'd never seen a party because all the military people had sort of looked after themselves and ripped everybody off. Well, that went rather well. So he thought, well, you know, we ought to continue this because parties are very good for social cohesion. So what he did was clear a big piece of land, and he thought, we'll have a spring carnival, a race. We'll get the horses out, and we'll call the park Hyde Park. So yes, they had a spring carnival, and everybody showed up. I mean, 3,000 people in Sydney couldn't believe that they were having a spring carnival, and the horses went around, and William Wentworth, I think, fell off his horse, and so went on. But there was no alcohol, although Colonel Macquarie, after 30 plus years in the army, really liked to have a drink. Well, so it was that he brought a bit of character and a bit of life to the colony, and he went on developing things and doing things. Well, in 1818, on the 26th of January, he decided that it was 30 years from the time that the fleet arrived in Sydney Cove. Now, I sort of feel like the event was urged on a bit because there was an architect that had arrived in Australia who got himself in a bit of trouble over forging a letter in his family will. And so he got found out and whatever else, and he was sent out to Australia. But this was Francis Greenway. So he was a great architect, but there he was in Australia. Well, when he showed up with two bits of paper. One that said, I've been sentenced to 14 years in the colony. The other piece of paper he had was a letter of reference from Arthur Phillip, because he knew Arthur Phillip and lived down the road from him. So when it came to 1818, because I think Francis Greenway was there and knew Phillip, then Macquarie thought, we'll have another party. So what he decided to do was, first we'll have a regatta. We'll get all the boats out on the harbour, and I'll get a steamship. It'll leave the dock at about 9 a.m. And if you want to be on it, then you better get down and get yourself a ticket. Of course, there'll be a good day's party out there watching the boats. And I better do something. We'll give the day off to all the officers in the public service and the government, and I'll give them an extra pound of fresh meat. I'll inspect the troops, he thought, and I'll have a dinner for all the officers. And so on top of all of that, then Greenway with Mrs. Macquarie decided that they were going to do a ball on the 26th of January. And Francis Greenway put up this lovely big poster, and it said, this is a phenomenal day, and we want to recognise Arthur Phillip for his wonderful contribution to this country that's now actually moving along quite well. So the ball went well, and the day went well. And after that, they thought, well, the 26th was a great day because it was the day that they landed in Sydney Cove. It was not the day that Arthur Phillip arrived in Australia. That was the 18th of January. It was not the day that Arthur Phillip went around to Sydney Cove. That was the 22nd. It was not even the day that Arthur Phillip came around to Sydney Cove and said, I've arrived, we're going to set up the colony here. That was the 25th. He waited for the rest of the fleet to arrive. The officers got off the boat. They hoisted a flag for I don't know what reason. They got out the cheap wine they'd bought in South Africa. They toasted the king's health and watched the sunset. It was really quite a non-event. The big day for Australia was a week or so later on the 7th of February, because that's the day that all the convicts were there, the officers were there, all the Marines were in uniform, the band played. David Collins, the new judge advocate, read the letters patent and declared that Britain now owned Australia. That was the day of the beginning of the British in this country. So really, I always wonder why it wasn't the 7th of February. But as time goes on, of course, when we get up to 1901, when we get a constitution and they have an inauguration for Australia to become a constituted country, the date is January the 1st. And of course, everybody says, well, how are we going to get over New Year's Eve and have a party again on the 1st of January? But that really is the day that we started as a nation. There wasn't an Australia legally before that. One could not call themselves an Australian really before that. I mean, you can say you're African or you're European, but how many countries are in Africa? How many countries are in Europe? And it was the same in Australia. But we became a legal entity with our own democracy on January the 1st, 1901. Now, I sort of didn't have really, everybody in Australia turned out. It was just this wonderful ceremony. Thousands of people were in the streets and the parks in Sydney and Melbourne to celebrate this wonderful occasion. But it wasn't, in fact, till 1935 that they decided that they were going to call a celebration on the 26th of January Australia Day. But all the states tend to fudge it a bit. They all wanted long weekends. So Australia Day wasn't on the 26th. It was on any convenient day that gave us a long weekend. Now, the other interesting thing is in 1949, they passed the Australian Citizenship Act. And in fact, at that point, for the first time, we became Australian citizens. Before that, even though we were constituted as a nation, we were British subjects. I talked to someone this week. He said, I was actually born in Australia in 47, before we had the Citizenship Act. So I was born a British subject, yet I was born in Australia. So I automatically got, I suppose I got 2 passports. You know, he was scratching his head about how he was a British subject, and yet because he was born here, also an Australian. So it wasn't until after Prince Charles, now King Charles, came here in 88 to celebrate the 200 years, and the Sydney Harbour was full of ships. It was just magnificent. And I was there at Lady Macquarie's chair looking down on the Opera House, and there was Prince Charles giving the most wonderful talk, of course, about what a wonderful country we all were, that I think we actually decided that, oh, we ought to celebrate Australia Day a bit more often. And it was actually under the Keating government a few years later in 1994, that he said, that's it, we're all going to celebrate Australia Day on the same day, on the 26th of January. So that's the strange, interesting story about why we have Australia Day on the 26th. But it doesn't really matter, does it? It's our day. It's our day. When we decide we're going to get out the flags, we're going to have a barbecue, we're going to be just proud to be Australians. And good on us for actually deciding that, you know, with everything else that goes on in the world, this is a blasted, lovely country to belong to. So there's your story, Bill, about how we got to be Australia Day.
Yeah, but the point is too, there was no Australia when Macquarie had his celebrations and all those sort of things that occurred. Now, it was still New South Wales, and I come from Western Australia. So when we had this first fleet sail in, park in Botany Bay, and then shift around to Port Jackson and then to Sydney Cove, and then they they had that, like you say, they had that ceremony on the 25th, 26th, but it was only the officers basically and Phillip on shore, and like I say, it was a fairly well non-event. It wasn't a proclamation or anything like that. Like that was on the 7th when everyone was ashore, everyone was in their place, and then like you say, the judge advocate read the letters of patent. So that's the ceremony for New South Wales. Now, at that time, Britain did not claim from the longitude I think it was 129 at that stage, no, 133. The rest was still New Holland. So West Australia and a little bit of the Northern Territory was actually up for grabs by any foreign power.
Yes and no. There's and by the way, you're right. They actually called it Foundation Day from 1818. They didn't call it Australia Day, of course. And Flinders had used the word Australia because it's simply the Latin word for southern, and terra meaning land, Australis meaning southern land. So he took the word Australis, which was 1,000 years old with the Romans plus, and he then deviated and called it Australia. And there's actually a map in my book of Flinders going around Australia that he actually puts the word Australia on his map as he circumnavigated the country. It's fascinating. But
wasn't Macquarie the first one to put it into statute?
You're right. So Macquarie was the first one to actually use the word for the nation. In the book, I also found a fascinating little incident where the French ambassador walked in to see the British Minister for Colonies, I think, and he said, "Is there any part of Australia that you don't own?" And the answer was no. And it was just this great little quote that, that anybody else give it up. You can tell me, Bill, the date. I should know, and it'll come to me. What year was it that they landed at at what is now known Perth at the Swan River. Is it
No,
the
well,
1840s?
actually, they got the bit of a worries, and they sent a detachment to Albany in 1826, and they put a military
Yeah,
complement
it was a
there.
military base. Again, they
Yeah,
were concerned
and
about
then
the
of course they
French.
were concerned about someone else coming up. But the whole point is, under the rules of terra nullius and all that sort of thing, although if when you take over a place, you actually got to work the land and you've got to actually do
Yeah,
something with it. Otherwise, it's still up for grabs. And
yeah,
that's why West Australia was technically still up to grabs. If someone else came in, that would have then there'd
yeah.
have to be a dispute. But there was nothing to stop the French or the Dutch coming
Well,
ashore, start doing something, and then they can have an
yeah,
argument over that. But well, West Australia was not protected by the fact that the
now,
British were occupying the eastern states.
yeah.
And we always, and West Australians will always feel aggrieved and feel like they're the other siders.
Well, we're all colonies, and here's a quote from Robert Menzies, and this is 1948. And I sort of wonder about the context. He was in London, and in a speech he said, "If we continue to deny and erode the foundations of our country, Australia, it is no good then complaining that we have destroyed the country." And yes, he was saying, if we bring in people from other places that run down our country and destroy the ethic that makes this country great, don't go complaining when you've destroyed the country that you created. And he was right. He is right in what he said, because we were all British colonies. We all had the same constitutions under the British Parliament, and we're all ruled, as we still are, in principle, under the Crown, although we've taken over the Crown ourselves, but it's still the principle that runs. I mean, we were part of the greatest empire that has ever existed. They brought civilization. I mean, there was a stage when I was in school, and maybe you too, when you could turn the globe and it was pink all over. And what was it? What was the phrase? The sun never sets on the British Empire. Was that it? And I mean, we forget how huge and how a part of something magnificent. I mean, I hate the bureaucracy, but that's what Britain brought us, was organisation, administration. But I think it's gone a bit too far about you, but I hate my Gold Coast Council. I wish they'd go away. Too much bureaucracy. But they brought civilization to the world wherever they went. And we were part of that. People were proud to be part of that, to be British. And I remember, I think it was the First World War that, that Britain, of course, wanted troops to help fight the Germans, I think, at that stage again. And somebody in Western Australia sort of said, well, must have been Irish descent, why are we, going to send troops to support Britain? And another MP stood up and said, how dare you? I mean, if Britain asks, that's what we do. I mean, you can hear the sort of the patriotism, the understanding that we were British. Of course, whatever Britain wants, that's us.
Well, the thing is, there wasn't that many generations of non-British. I mean, we still...
What's that?
People were still riding from Britain to colonise and settle in Australia. So there was a lot of, people who had only immigrated from the United Kingdom, plus first-generation people.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot of people who were 5 generations or that.
Yeah.
Because the population of Australia, when it was constituted, I think there was only 3 million Australians altogether. So we're still growing our numbers from people from primarily from the UK.
Yeah, I mean, Australia has been a country of immigrants. Up until 1900, 95% of the people here had come from Britain. What I found interesting was the second largest group were Germans. There were a lot of Germans that had come to Australia at that point, but 95% of the people in Australia in 1900 were of British descent. But of course, the populate or perish principle that came out, politicians realized that we had to populate after the Second World War. That's not a bad thing. People, we had a dream. We had a dream in 1900 of a phenomenal country, of prosperity, of safety, of democracy. And people came to this country, came off the boats from Italy and other places after the war, wanting to share that dream and our wonderful, massive blue sky and the endless beaches. You know, they'd had arrived in paradise and wanted to put their shoulder to the wheel and did make a success of themselves. Our problem is that we've gone insane with our immigration, and we now are importing people who do not want to share our dream. They want to remain linked to the countries, the strife and the divisions of which they have fled or left. And bringing those divisions into this country is now causing us a lot of trouble.
And will continue to. Just in regards to the Foundation Day, or Australia Day, if they had picked any other day than January the 1st, like if they just had to say, well, we've got to pick a day, well, let's make it with the financial year, the start of the new financial year. Yeah. If they had to pick something like the 1st of July, we wouldn't be having this discussion, because it would simply be that's the date the country was formed as Australia. Yeah. That's when the proclamation was read and everything else. It would have been set in concrete with that.
Yeah.
The fact that the New Year's Day is the only flaw in the argument for Australia being on the day that actually that proclamation and the Constitution was read out.
But you see, again, I mean, if we go back 30 or something years, we didn't have this sort of problem. Yes, we have Aboriginal people, and of the 300,000 or so that are on welfare to say they're Indigenous, it is, again, 1% of all Indigenous people in this country are actually full-blood Aborigines. And at 1900, they did a census of Australia, and the censor himself gets to the point of looking at Indigenous people, and he stops and discusses the fact that even in 1900, only 5% of Indigenous people were actually full-blood. And he makes the comment that we had created a new mixed race in Australia. Now, that's not uncommon. I mean, Singapore's like that. Brazil is like that. America, certainly with the blacks, black people in America, dark, whatever, are of the same sort of Creole mixed blood. And so are our Aborigines. They're Creole people. There's only, as I said, only 1%. The other interesting statistic is, of all married Indigenous people, 70% are married to non-Indigenous people. Now, that's a huge percentage. When you stop and think about that, you're only looking at 1 or 2 generations, and they've bred themselves out of existence if these numbers continue on. Our problem arises when they've got too much money and power, and this crowd called the First People, they're not necessarily Aborigines. It's a political group, really, and it's really, looking for money. But when I went and had a look at the Uluru Statement, and then in Queensland, what the Labor government was trying to push through, this pathway to treaty, in both documents, the First Nation political party declared that they were not Australians, and they were demanding that the citizens of this state and of this country pay them money because they were not Australian. And you stop and you scratch your head, well, do you want to go somewhere else, or would you like a piece of land somewhere? We could put up a barbed wire fence and give you a different passport and, visas to come back into Australia. You could purchase your own communication, electricity. You could even do a Belt and Road, I suppose, with the Chinese and see how they work out. So you sort of wonder where they were going in the nonsense of saying, we're not Australian. When I looked into this business of not Australian, here comes this primitive religion. And remember, we're talking now about a mixed race of people. But the Stone Age religion that they're now claiming to want to belong to was pantheism. And that is God is in everything. It is in the trees and in us, and we're all part of God. And the ancestors, they're the ones, the pro-creators that made the earth. And I mean, that's a whole other thing worth exploring as well, that all these people that murdered each other and their children and their wives all suddenly were good spirits making the earth. But it's anti-Christian, totally anti-Christian to think that the earth was made and everything living was made by ancestral spirits and not the God of heaven and earth. But that's the religion that they cling to. And so, of course, I find it quite offensive when I find people making this declaration of their religion when I'm on an airplane and welcoming me to my own country. It's terribly offensive to me to be welcome to Australia, but that's another issue as well, I suppose. Anyway,
but I think I think the thing is where we are at today with the pushback and that after the referendum, we are now on this pathway that we've got a situation where more people are willing to pronounce that they support Australia Day on the 26th, and that percentage is going to continue to grow. But all I'm saying in this episode, why didn't we explore other days other than this? Like we're looking at the 7th of February as when we actually made it. If you go back to October 1900, when the letters of patent were signed by Victoria. Why aren't those crucial events significant enough to say, well, that's the day when she recognised the Constitution of Australia, put the letters forward for the letter of patent. So they are just as interesting dates. But what we've got to get ourselves into the situation now is the for and against the 26th has now become so dogmatic that we're not open to any other suggestion by a vast number of the population.
I suppose we could hold a referendum and give everybody an alternative date, like pick a flag or pick an anthem. And if everybody decided it was going to be the February the 5th or the 7th, and we all said that's our day, then by referendum, that's our day. But it comes symbolic. The Americans have got their 4th of July. And if you just watch the inauguration, they are so enthusiastic about their country. And I sort of felt like I was standing in the shadows a bit as an Australian, feeling that, well, we don't celebrate the new government like that. We watch the declaration by the new Prime Minister that says he promises to fulfill the law and honour the Crown and serve the people. But it's just not that wonderful, incredible event that we've just seen with the Americans. I sort of feel like, we had a big day. But the issue you raise is important. You see, if the fight wasn't over the 26th of January, would the fight be over something else? Would it be the invasion? They invaded us, which is a lot of rubbish, of course. It was only 700 troops and 700 convicts, that were glad to get off the ship, and most of them had lived. And here they were to establish a new settlement. You can hardly call it an invasion. One good raid from the Aborigines, and they were happy to sort of participate in the new colony, to get fish as the ships came in, to have food and to clothing. And within 2 years, Aborigines were living successfully in the colony. And within 2 years, Arthur Phillip was made an elder, an Aboriginal elder, and given the name Wallawari. And Bennelong didn't call him governor, he called him father. And we have totally lost the amazing integrated society that Australia became in those first few years when the British arrived. And it's a shame that people jump up and down and protest, and they miss the magnificence of just the British have finally arrived to help these people and to do something with this incredible country.
Yes, I think there's not enough emphasis on those initial years, because in those initial years, even into the almost probably 18, 15, probably a bit beyond that, there was a lot of assimilation, and there was a number of areas where basically almost Indigenous communities living very Western style life. The big problem happened because of Tasmania. You can go back down to what happened there, and of course, a lot of people will argue that the population was decimated by settlement and
Oh.
that. But the truth of the matter, there was a lot of problems in regards to how, our diseases had a big effect, and that. But the other thing that happened is, I can't remember his name, but there was a guy basically became the protector of Indigenous people in Tasmania. And because the big problem is they were being their numbers were declining. There was far too much integration. They thought they would become basically extinct if they didn't do something. So they started with the idea of sending them off to Flinders Island, which was no help at all, because Flinders Island was even worse than Tasmania. It was out in the Bass Strait, so that didn't help their life expectancies. Then they brought them back to Prinny Island, and this guy who became the protector, he actually came up with this formula of separation and protection of Indigenous, and then he brought that to the mainland. And so one of the things that happened in Sydney later on is the Indigenous community to sort of protect their culture and that. What they started to do is to take them out of the assimilation program and separate them into a protectionist area. And that's probably did more harm than good. We probably wouldn't have that problem if we kept with the original philosophy of Phillip, Governor Phillip, in regards to everyone's the same, basically.
Yeah, you got to watch the Tasmanian story. There was incredible massacres in Tasmania, and more than 250 white settlers had been massacred as they tried to settle in that region. It wasn't the Aborigines that were being massacred, it was the whites, and the governor eventually tried to do something with no effect, as you're pointing out, and it was actually a Reverend Robinson who tried to move people to Flinders Island, and British thought it was terribly successful, and then moved him on to do something in South Australia. So he did it in a number of places. But you're right about the Flinders Society. I mean, people were moving there freely. I mean, just because Reverend Robinson said, "Why don't you come to Flinders Island?" and they wanted to. So, I mean, when they did this walk through the bush business to try and catch any Aborigines, if you've read it, they caught one old man and a boy. I mean, Aborigines could see them coming, hear them coming. I mean, they were bush people. And I mean, Tasmania is a huge country for the several hundreds of people that walked across the Great Tasmania. I don't know, they didn't catch anybody at all. So it's a mixed bag of stories. But there's a great story I put in the book about a young woman born on Flinders, and her father was a sailor, mother was Aboriginal, so she was Creole, and she had married a fellow that was a convict. Now, you've got to understand that convict wasn't incarceration. It was actually sentenced to labour, to do work and not come back to Britain for 7 years. So he went off to work and left her at the hut, and some full-blood Aboriginals attacked her and tried to kill her and put a spear through her daughter, and she was in the hut, and they tried to burn it down, and she only had a gun with shot in it, and she tried to fire that. Anyway, a neighbour heard and called the police, and the soldiers came, but the husband came home beforehand, but they were out to kill her. Now, here's something very important. Why were they out to kill her? Because she was not a pure blood Aborigine. And if you were not a pure blood, then you didn't have the totems from your mother and your father, and so you could not enter a tribe and successfully breed other Aborigines. They had to have the totems. And so there was a great move to try and kill the half-breed people, which of course then led to the Creole Aborigines living on the edge of white settlements, and that's how that developed. And then, of course, they've tried to take back their understanding of their Aboriginal culture. So we've got to watch that Tasmanian thing. The protectors and the protectorates actually came out of the British Parliament after a good review, and they brought it in to protect the Aborigines because they were working on stations and whatever and getting ripped off. And so the protector was there to try and help them. And they're on the various settlements. The other thing that happened is that if young Billy, for want of any other name, went off and did some work and came back to the tribe, then they wanted his money. So he'd done the work and they did the drinking. And that needed to stop as well. There was a woman called Daisy Bates, a phenomenal woman. She spent 40 years living with the Aborigines in Western Australia and on the border of Western Australia and South Australia. And she became a protectorate, I believe, in 2 states and a justice of the peace. It's a terrific story of this woman giving up a life. I believe a duke of somebody, I should know, got off the train and went to see her. And there she is in the one good dress that she had, again, next to the train. And he went back and said, this woman deserves a knighthood. She didn't get an MBE, a member of the British Empire. They awarded her a KBE, a Knight of the British Empire, for her work with the Aborigines. She spoke more than 100 Aboriginal languages, a phenomenal woman who was there literally protecting the people in the tribes and the women from the violence. So when I got in to have a look at the protectionists, there was a meeting, I think, in about 1938, and they came together in Canberra, and I got hold of the notes of the actual conference, and I couldn't fault it. They went through and they discussed the needs and the problems and what they were going to do, and it's a terrific conference. It's there, a reference, I think it's under David Bates somewhere, or under the protectionists. But you could not fault the heart and the motivation of the people involved in the protectionist scheme as they sought to do the best that they could for the Creole Aboriginal people.
I think a lot of the problem is most Australians don't know Australian history. They don't really look into it. And so it's very easy for activists, historians, to cherry pick something and then distort it or whatever and deliver that note. I mean, if you take the instance of Tasmania, you know, one of the first stories, and it's and he actually has a same surname as you, Reynolds. He's a professor down in Tasmania, and he came up with the story that, you know, just after they arrived in is it Rosstown or something, which was the first settlement before they moved on the other side of Derwent, that, you know, the first group of troops and settlers there, you know, killed some 200 Indigenous people in a day.
Oh, it's rubbish. You're talking about
put them in barrels, barrels, and then, you know, for Melbourne and sent them off to Sydney to go over to Britain's thing. Like, how that gets the light of day and gets, you know, a story. This going back a few years. This going probably back into the early 2000s, maybe the 90s, and that was actually printed in Australia and reprinted in a United States paper. Now, no one can tell me that you can get 200 Indigenous people in the days when people only had muskets to stand there, and when your whole detachment's only got 25 soldiers and they're spread out all over the place, that you can get them to stand there long enough to load and reload enough to kill 200 on a day. Like, really, don't give it, you know. No, but these people have got credence.
Now, when I started this project, I was asked to do a children's book on Australian history. And I said to the publisher, well, I said, how are you going to do a children's book? I said, you know, what are you going to do? We're going to dumb it down or make it a comedy? You know, I said, so I wriggled in the seat and said, look, it's been years since I did the research. Let me get back into it, and I'll get back to you once I sort of work out what we're doing. Well, once I started the research, I felt like I was suffering, or other people were suffering from the Santa Claus syndrome. And that was, if you tell yourself the same rubbish often enough, then you start to believe it. So here was one author that was up to the 5th edition of the same stuff that he'd written, 30 years ago, or another guy had a new book, but it was a new title of, again, the same stuff. And one guy was quoting this guy, and this guy quoted that guy. And I mean, I got really, really angry with the fact that these people didn't have any original documents. So without me picking on a couple of authors that just set me right off, I decided that what I needed to do was get back to original documents. So in writing that book that I think is behind me, I looked at more than 600 articles and books. I quote some 300, and 50% of those are more than 100 years old. I wanted the original documents. If you tell me that there were 200 people killed by 25 soldiers, and I don't think there were that many that went down with Collins when he set up the colony down there, David Collins. I mean, again, you could have wiped them out in the middle of the night. I mean, the Aborigines were great at sort of attacking families and killing women and children in the middle of the night. They could have killed them all in the middle of the night, but they didn't. So I need the diary notes. And I will not accept that they just fudged it out and didn't say that happened. They did record all the things that happened. And again, I wanted 3 or 4 diaries to cross-reference what really happened and other people's reviews of those times. The earliest document I got to was 1595. 1595, I was reading the Elizabethan Act, which became known as the Poor Laws, that affected transportation to Australia in 1787. I was looking for original documents. So when it came to Tasmania, again, the diaries are there. The official documents going back to Britain are there if people want to read them. But I am really not interested in listening to what Aunt Margaret said to Aunt Mary, to Uncle Bill at the other end of the bar. I'm not interested in just writing down what people think or what people have heard. I've got to have the documents that report what actually, that's history. Anything else can be rumor
about Britain
or anthropology. I'm only interested in writing up what actually happened.
I think the most interesting thing with Britain is it didn't rely on one source of information.
You're right.
In regards to Tasmania, that instance in down there, I think there was diaries kept by the surgeon, right? He was responsible for providing his diary information to the colonial officers. There was the person in charge, obviously Collins, and there was also a cleric of some description, and they were all obliged, and Collins second in command. So 4 people were obliged to provide information, a diary account, basically every day. So you've got not just one person and sort of collaboration to make one story. There's actually 4 different diaries on more every event that happened.
Yeah, I mean, even when it came to the landing in Botany Bay and then Sydney Cove, I mean, I was reading the diary from the doctor Tench, William Tench, the ship's doctor on the Alexander, Smythe Bowen or something. I mean, then you had Arthur Phillip's diary, David Collins' diary, and you also had Captain King's diary. So how many is that? So when they're telling me the stories of what takes place, it's a bit like reading the New Testament. You're looking at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. I mean, you can soon do the cross references to see if they're telling the truth. There's a woman out of Sydney, Cameron Ash, and she happens to be married, I understand. Maybe I'm wrong, but she's married to the French ambassador or something. So she's written up this record of Australia that's terribly pro-French. And so she has this whole silly concept that La Perouse was in a race to get to Sydney with Arthur Phillip. He didn't even know Arthur Phillip was on the water until he got a letter from the French, and then he just sort of paddles down to the Sandwich Islands and the Hawaii, and then he stops off at Norfolk Island, and then he sort of gets into Botany Bay. But one of the captains was a guy called Conrad, and he was Irish, and he went over to meet Phillip and to give letters to Arthur Phillip, Captain, the governor, to send on the Alexander back to England and back to France. And so Phillip gets into this wonderful conversation about, well, how have you been getting on? You know, you've been following Captain Cook's journeys, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I got to read that conversation of what took place. Well, this idiot, I'll call her an idiot, Cameron Ash, she wants to say that Arthur Phillip took his horses and his carriage, horses and carriage, through the bush from Sydney Cove across to Botany Bay and had a party with La Perouse. Well, Phillip says, I never met La Perouse. Well, I mean, who's right, Phillip or this woman that wants to make it up? And she says it's in the diary of the doctor on the Alexander, and this is the date. Well, I had his diary, didn't I? And he doesn't make any reference at all to such a meeting. So it's the same when I come to looking at these issues to do with the Aboriginal people and how they got on. So again, you can read how well Bennelong got on with Arthur Phillip within basically days. And even Manly was Phillip called the place in Manly after a fellow who walked out to touch his boat and say hello. Oh, that's a pretty manly thing to do. We'll call the place Manly. And we've missed all that wonderful integrated, the stories of people's lives that were mixing in that early colony. And people are making stuff up and trying to divide us. Yeah, if you're Australian, be happy about it. Celebrate it. It's our wonderful country.
But do you think also word of mouth, you know, from within families rather than going to real history has caused the problem? Like I remember as a kid, you know, and this is the 50s, and my father talking about what happened in Tasmania, and his story is the general story that we're all the bad guys, and we're trying to cut their numbers down, and we had the big black line and all this, and we killed hundreds and that. Like how do people allow to get their history to be so distorted, and why isn't the education system and the government and the media and the publications putting everything in the right context to give people a truthful outlook of the whole thing rather than allowing a thing to fester and allow people to pick these basically word of mouth myth sort of thing to become the feature of our history.
Yeah. I mean, I hear it. I know what you're saying, and yes, I grew up with it too. And they're myths. They're myths, and we sort of there must have been this massacre of Tasmanians. It's a myth. Now that is what's significant about this book. I wrote this book. Now I'm an intellectual and I'm an academic. When I wrote this book, I come at this project with integrity. I will have no opinion. I will write the facts. If I have an opinion, I'll put it in brackets, and often it's just a comical observation of what was taking place. I have not written that book as an opinion piece. I'm interested in the facts, which means that if someone comes along and shows me a document about a Captain Cook or something, I can make adjustments because I'm interested in what really happened. Now, it's by sheer accident that this book has become the most significant write-up of Australian history ever. As much as I've read everything else that's been done, I have done more research and came up with what really happened better than anybody else has ever done it. Now, there's a reason for it. It's not that I want to say I'm necessarily better. It's the internet. It now makes information more available than it was before. And I remember when I did my PhD, you just couldn't get information. I sent a copy of the book down to Jeffrey Blaney. You know, I respect Jeffrey. And I thought, oh, well, you know, here he is. He's been writing for years on Australian history. What does Jeffrey doesn't know? I'll send him a copy of the book. And he wrote me back and he said, my goodness, he said, the research. He said, you even know how many Bibles that Reverend Johnson took out to Australia. He said, you've got to be congratulated for the effort you've done in the research. So I gave him a call and I said to Jeffrey, this is an honour for me to be talking to you. I said, would you launch the book for me in Melbourne? He said, I'm 92 years old now. He said, they don't let me out much. But it was such a compliment for this man who his head's in the bucket of Australian history, for him to open my book and for him to be getting an education. And it just has not been possible to get the information that I've written up. And it is a foundation book. I'm presently writing up a book called Leaders and Larrikins, The Great Australian Stories. And it's going to be a lot of fun meeting these people, getting into the conversations. And you're going to meet Lachlan Macquarie as he talks to his young wife. And he's got this broad Scottish accent and he's employed an Irish banker to help him run the colony. And you're going to meet the people. It's going to be a really great book. But after this, I'm going to try and do something with this, the big book, so that it can be taught in schools. So I need a teacher's companion and I need exercises and whatever essay questions, so that it can be taught in schools for people to be actually learning our wonderful and fantastic history of this country.
Okay, look, we're looking at we're going to settle on the 26th as the best day.
Yeah, 26th.
And the thing to point out, although I still got a leaning to the 7th when everyone was there.
Yeah.
But we're probably not going to get that hurdle. But I think the important thing about the 7th is not only was everyone off the boat then, and the proclamation went, the Indigenous people were gathered there as well, from my understanding. So there's the point in time. There is the point in time where everyone stood together. Everyone who was on the continent basically was represented in some form or matter. And the country was, or the New South Wales proclaimed, the settlement was proclaimed. So that's sort of my leaning, because the first one was just the officers doing their thing because that was what they were expected to do. But the 7th sounds to me like a better day that's more inclusive.
Yeah.
But if we can't get to that, we can't get to that. But the important part with that day is the Indigenous were British subjects at that time. Everyone who was in Australia was a British subject, whether they knew it or not.
Yeah.
And that would be the Indigenous in Arnhem Land, the people in Tasmania who haven't even seen a white man or any. They were actually really consigned to being British subjects right at time, as long with everyone else standing on that shoreline. So they were all one people then, even though they were British subjects.
Yeah.
So can we sort of also, because we've got this grievance group, can we come up with a better day for them that's separate? Like, I mean, when Cook got to Australia, he did land in a couple of points. I think he got here in about June or July or something.
I got to think about that.
At Port Hicks or something like that. And he stopped off and he actually landed in a few points. But his final flag planting and sort of acknowledgement of the lands, the kings and that, because basically what he did when he got to Possession Island on the 22nd of August, 1770, that was the last time he set foot and had the flag up there, unfurled the colours and said this is the land for King George and all that sort of stuff. But what he had by then, he had a chart of basically the majority of the eastern seaboard. Port Hicks is actually in Victoria, I think, just in the southern side. So he's mapped right from Victoria up past New South Wales, all of Queensland's Pacific coast, and it's now in the Torres Straits. So to me, when he makes that final proclamation on the 22nd of August saying, well, he's making this claim, would that be an appropriate day to say, all right, if you want to feel aggrieved, this is the day you were dispossessed, and make it dispossession day or something like that, and separate it from the argument of celebrating what Australia is.
Yeah. Well, the thing about Cook was he didn't want to come here. He got off the coast as fast as he could. He was a fanatic with a sextant that couldn't help himself but name everywhere. He just stood on the deck and got all the numbers. And he just sort of said, well, I claim the coastline. Now, you mentioned something earlier. Under the international law of terra nullius, you have to work the land. And this was all written up in a French document, and also with Locke and Hume, I think, also put words to, if you're going to claim, it's an old Irish concept, you don't own the land unless you work the land. So in that law of terra nullius, you couldn't just go down with just a military base. That wasn't sufficient under the law of terra nullius. You had to set up a settlement, and that's why they had to have the settlement to claim Australia. But you mentioned something that was very important a moment ago when you talked about February the 7th, and you noted that the Aborigines were also, of course they would have been, the band is playing and people are in uniform, and why wouldn't you come out and lean against the tree and watch it all happening? But in that declaration that was read, for the first time, Britain was establishing a colony, because all the other colonies had been private joint ventures. This was the first time that the actual British government. And in that document, the king said, I am now declaring that all the people of the continent are under my protection. They are under my protection under the British law and are British subjects. So yes, you were right, Bill, when you said that declaration that day made all the people in this country British subjects. And they did have. I'm about to write up in the Leaders of Larrikin and Leaders thing. I'm doing Macquarie, and I'm about to write up a fact that he gave permission for an Aboriginal fellow to sue a ship's captain or something. So the first law case that I've come across of an Aboriginal in court suing somebody that had wronged him was under Lachlan Macquarie for an Aboriginal. And so I'm going to write that up. I think that's a great story that he had equal rights in this country. And, you're right, we've forgotten the importance of that day, February the 7th.
I think the other thing is, if they had solicitors and that back then who worked pro bono, they probably would have done a good job for the Indigenous people, making sure that they were looked after. It wasn't the fact that they were just British. The thing that was missing, they didn't have good legal representation.
Oh, they're a bit short on good lawyers. At that point, to tell you the truth, I don't know how he got on, but yeah, they were having trouble with all the lawyers in the colony. Here's something funny. There was a judge that came out with Macquarie by the name, I think his first name was Francis Bent, and when he died, he got on really well with Lachlan Macquarie. His brother came out and then became a judge, and I've always wondered where we got the concept of a bent judge. And I sort of wonder whether it was because we had two judges, one after the other, that were called bent. But nevertheless, it's a lot of fun. I'm having such fun. The biggest problem that the colony faced were the blasted Marines all wanting to get rich and sell their rum. It caused an immense amount of trouble. Not the Aborigines and certainly not the integration issue.
Well, I think that's always a problem when sort of there's a methodology available to make money far above your station. It will cause all sorts of angst. But just in that short time, like between Phillip and Macquarie, I think did we have Bligh in there somewhere as well?
Yeah, just before Macquarie, yeah.
We had some poor governors.
Yes, his problem, Bligh was an old sea dog and he wanted things done his way. The biggest problem that Bligh had was this blasted individual called John MacArthur. And John MacArthur had got in a duel with a fellow Colonel Patterson and nearly killed him. And so the governor at the time, Hunter, sent him off to England to stand trial. Well, when he got there, what the bugger did was he found the documents and threw them overboard. So when he got to England, there was no case against him. Oh, he's a shocking individual, John MacArthur. And then he started to sing the song about how he could grow all these sheep and what he could do. And because England was starting a war with France, they thought, well, maybe it's a good idea if we give him a bit of land. So they said, well, we'll give him 5,000 acres. And if he's good, then we'll give him another 5,000. Well, this Scot couldn't get over the fact that he didn't get the whole 10,000. And he was after Governor Bligh to get the other 10,000. Well, Bligh said, well, the document says when you do well on the first 5,000 and clear it and you've got sheep, you can have the other side there. I don't really care. But it was the fact that he got into trouble with the law over a ship that had allowed a convict to escape. And because of that, he'd also imported a still, and he was up for a fine, and he wouldn't go to court. And the provost marshal, the chief of the marshal of the court, came to see him, and he wouldn't answer the door, and eventually he was arrested and put in jail. And there he was, this quite insane fellow. Oh, the colony's coming down, and everybody's going to be arrested. And it was actually John MacArthur that brought about the insurrection against Bligh. And I mean, what could he do? You know, he had the army were all stirred up, and they really did think. So it was an insurrection, and the officers did stand trial. And yes, they did then send Colonel Macquarie down to sort them all out, which he did quite quickly. He just put the Rum Rebellion crowd, the 102 Regiment, on a ship and sent them home. Got rid of a lot of them. So you know, it wasn't so much that Bligh was a bugger; it was John MacArthur that was the trouble in the colony.
Well, I think from our conversation, I think we've got grounds to have a referendum on a date.
Yeah, we do. Oh, yeah, we do.
The 26th of January or the 7th, and both those cases be argued. And like I say, the other thing is give the grievance industry their separate date, and whether it's the 22nd of August, which was the last planting of the flag on Possession Island after Cook had chartered it, that may be a solution, but we need to have a solution. And the thing is, where it currently is, although we have now a more popular conversation or a more robust public saying that they support the 26th, it still doesn't bury the issue. It needs to be buried once and for all, either by a referendum, I think. And I think that's a good choice of those two days.
We could have a preferential voting system.
That one sort of thing.
You could put up February the 7th and January 26th and August the 22nd.
No, 22nd not for Australia Day. 22nd
preferential referendum
for depossession day. You can get that's for the grievance industry, because they need this special day to keep it away from Australia Day, whatever it is. So let them have their grievance day on that day.
Yeah, oh, well, it doesn't matter. If we pick the 7th of February, they'd still say it was an invasion. And if we, pick the 27th of August, they'd still say, oh, well, it wasn't your land or something another. Well, it wasn't your land either. You didn't own the land. It's a stupid concept for an Indigenous person to say they own land. It's a nonsense, because they didn't have any sense of value. They didn't own anything. So it's a silly notion to think that we invaded something, because it's just philosophically, historically, legal nonsense. But yeah, I think it's up to pick a date if that's going. But would it really satisfy those who are against us doing it?
You never satisfy everyone, so that's the thing. But I mean, once you got it, if you had a referendum, it's locked in by a referendum. That's the end of the discussion.
That's it.
And everyone has to suck it up.
That's it. Once we've had a referendum, just like we're going to have a nation, that's it. We're now Australia. All the states are in it. So yes, we could have a referendum. I'm up for that. And we can hold it on Australia Day.
Okay, no worries. We'll leave that conversation there, but I suppose you'll be having a lager on Australia Day for Australia.
Yeah, I'm going to a ball the night before. I'm going to have a big day this year and a party on the day. So yeah, I'm going to make a big deal out of it. I looked around and I thought, I don't have anything that's got Australia on it. I wore out my thongs and I don't have a T-shirt or something. I'll have to go out and buy something. Why not a hat at least?
Well, at least this year you can go to Woolworths and get something.
Hey?
at least this year you can go to Woolworths and get something.
Woolworths. Yeah, they're back to
after
line,
last
aren't they?
year's boycott. So maybe you
Coles,
don't want to make it up with him, go to Coles or whatever, somewhere else, or Kmart, whatever.
Yeah.
But
Now, hopefully there's people listening that have got an interest in this book since I've been raving about getting your details straight. And people, you're going to love reading it, As I said, it's arrived in Buckingham Palace. So I'm waiting for a letter from the King to say, oh, what a capital idea, a great book on Australian history. But you can get it if you just go to the website, and that's easy enough. It's my name, Reynolds, without the S, called Reynolds Learning, one word, reynoldslearning.com. You go to history, and if you go to buy the book, I'll give you a 25% discount on the price of the book. There's a slot that says, do you have a voucher code? If you put in 1770, can you remember that one? Yeah. 1770 in that slot for a voucher code, you'll get 25 or something dollars, $30 knocked off the price. So there you go. You go to reynoldslearning.com.
We'll be putting that up on the websites, the Facebook page.
Would you please? That'd be great.
With the link to the book, and we'll also annotate that with the promotion code.
Thank you very much, Bill. I'm only too pleased to be talking to as many people as possible, because it's just a great country, and I've had such fun writing up this fantastic history of our wonderful country. I feel like my wife hasn't read the book. She just listened to me charge in every few days going, oh, look what I found now. She just listened to me talk about it as I was writing it up. I've had such fun doing it. Anyway, thank you very much, Bill.
Even the students' the students of history would find new information. And like the most important part of it is that the references are there and they're valid.
Yes.
Whereas I think this is one of the biggest problems with Wind Shuttle, what he called out in regards to the fabrication of Indigenous history, basically, was because a lot of the references quoted by a lot of historians at the bottom of their books are not accurate, or don't actually don't provide the material for what they're referencing with the subject they're talking about. But they just fill the pages up with, these are the references, and no one goes and checks.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until Wind Shuttle started to go back and look at those references and find the flaws, the fact either they were on a completely different topic than what they were supposed to be references of. So that's the problem. Whereas your reference, and I think the interesting thing with your referencing, you've also been able to have access to British archives. Is that correct?
Yeah. This was an exciting moment. I got into the archives of the British Foreign Office. Now, sort of think about this. This is sort of like MI6 and MI5. This is all the spies versus spies and all the documents that they keep hidden in the Navy records. And I got into the Foreign Office archives, and I could swim through it all these diaries. And I got some terrific references by just getting in and chasing around what other people were saying. So whenever a person said something, I would go and check the reference, and that would just open up so much for me in doing that.
Although a lot of these archives are available to public, the problem is navigating them. In some instances, like I've tried to deal with Queensland archives and that, and you get, as an ordinary person, you get limited sort of access, sort of thing, and you driving through the system is not that easy. You really do, unless you've got full access, unlimited access. You really need someone to help you navigate and find the information. It's like when we produced a book based on the 1890 separation petition out of central Queensland. Now that was in archives, and it didn't take too much to sort out, but actually pulling the information and the copies and that was a bit more difficult. It would have been helpful if someone within archives assisted us a bit more. But I think that's a problem. People can get into these archives in a sort of public manner, but you really can't get to the bowels of the whole situation unless you got a lot of time you're very driven, or you got some inside help.
I didn't have too much inside help.
Well, you must have been driven and also
Oh,
very
driven.
persistent.
It was a reading of the rubbish, and just the rubbish I was reading. I mean, there was a stage I was reading Keneally, and I'd read enough at this stage. I was reading something in Keneally, and it wasn't just he was downright wrong. There's another word I could use for when you're not telling the truth. And I just got so angry with it, and I slammed the book. I swore at him. I turned around and I threw the book in the garbage bin. I just had enough of the rubbish that I was reading. Well, that didn't turn out well for me because it turned out to be my wife's book and I had to get it out again. But nevertheless, I got to the point that was it. It was down tools, and I was now going to do the research to find out what actually happened. Anyway, there it is.
Okay. Okay, look, we'll leave our conversation there for today. I'll get in contact with you tomorrow with the details of this episode. Also post it to the different Facebook pages and put those links to both your book and the promotion code on those Facebook pages. So hopefully you get a bit of custom out of that. But again, I'd just like to thank you for the time. But if you just stay on the line, I'll introduce next week's show and just have a quick conversation off air.
Thank you, Bill, and have a great Australia Day.
I will. I'll make sure I down some Australian ale.
Yeah, that's what we need to do. It's good for social cohesion.
That's it.
Governor Macquarie said.
Okay, then, no worries. If you just enjoyed tonight's show, please like, share, and subscribe to our Facebook page, and also subscribe to our YouTube channel. Now, next week's episode, I'll be talking to Saxon Davis from the IPA, and we'll be discussing the finances of Australia, basically looking at the mid-year financial statement from the government and where we are, and we'll be discussing the ramifications of what happens when as we move into this election. With every $1 billion, a candidate or one of the parties promises to spend to get your vote. So we'll be looking at where Australians' bank balance is at the moment and where it will be heading to as we go through the election cycle and all the promises that will be doled out to get your vote. So please join us next week. Thank you.